Why does a single comment ruin your entire day? Why does one phone call, one look, one memory suddenly drain your energy, tighten your chest, and steal your peace, no matter how hard you try to stay calm? For most of your life, you were told that this is just how people are, that stress is normal, that anger comes from others, that worry is the price of caring. But here is the quiet truth most people never hear, even after 60 years of living. You are not disturbed by people. You are disturbed by the invisible habit of handing your inner state to them. Over time, without realizing it, you learn to react. You learn to seek approval to feel safe. You learn to fear disapproval as danger. You learn to expect life to behave a certain way in order for you to feel okay. None of this was your fault. It was conditioning, repeated, reinforced, normalized. And now those patterns run automatically, like an old machine you never chose to build. Every reaction feels instant, but it was learned slowly. Every emotional surge feels personal, but it follows a script written decades ago. The cost of this habit is not small. It shows up as chronic fatigue you can't explain, as tension in the body that never fully releases, as a quiet sadness, irritability, or loss of direction that settles in with age, as the feeling that life is moving, but you are no longer steering. This is the invisible chain, not made of events, not made of people, but made of attachment, approval, fear, expectation, wrapped so tightly around the mind that it feels like identity. Here is the first release. You are not weak. You are not broken. You were simply never shown where your power has been leaking all these years. Pause for one breath, just one, and notice, without judgment, what you have been allowing to disturb you lately. Because freedom does not begin by fighting the world. It begins by seeing clearly what you are still holding on to. 1. Letting go without losing your heart. Letting go does not mean becoming cold. It means you finally stop hurting yourself over things you were never meant to control. For many people over 60, this is one of the most painful misunderstandings of life. You were taught that caring deeply requires holding tightly, that love means worry, that responsibility means constant tension, that if you loosen your grip, everything and everyone will slip away. So you held on to relationships that changed, to roles that ended, to expectations that life quietly outgrew. And slowly, without realizing it, love turned into strain. Here's the first truth that brings relief. Love nourishes, attachment drains. There is an old Zen story about a monk who carried a woman across a river so she would not get wet. After setting her down, he continued his walk. Hours later, another monk angrily said, Why are you still carrying her in your mind?" The first monk smiled and replied, "I put her down at the river. You are still carrying her." Many people reach a later life still carrying old conversations, old regrets, old expectations. Not because they choose to, but because no one taught them the difference between caring and clinging. Attachment says, "I need this to stay the same for me to be okay." Love says, "I care deeply even if things change." Another quiet pain emerges here. Over the decades, identity has become fused with outcomes. You were someone's partner, someone's provider, someone's problem solver, someone's anchor. And when those roles shift or disappear, something inside asks, who am I now? This is where suffering deepens, not because life took something away, but because value was outsourced to what you did, who needed you, or how others responded to you. There is a Buddhist teaching that says suffering begins the moment the mind says, "This must not change." Aging, loss, distance, silence, none of these are cruel by nature. They become cruel only when we demand permanence from what was never permanent. Here is the release most people wait their entire lives for. Your worth was never located in outcomes, not in being needed, not in being praised, not in being remembered a certain way. When value returns inward, something remarkable happens. Loneliness softens. Fear loosens its grip. The heart begins to rest. A teacher once asked his students to hold a cup of water at arm's length. At first it felt easy. After a minute the arm trembled. After an hour it burned. The teacher said, "The weight did not change. Your holding did." This is how attachment works. Life is not heavier. You have simply been holding it too long. Detachment is not withdrawal from life. It is engagement without entanglement. You still love your children, but you release the need to control their paths. You still care about your health, but you stop fighting your body with fear. You still value connection, but you no longer abandon yourself to avoid being alone. For those facing quieter homes and longer evenings, this matters deeply. Detachment does not erase loneliness, but it removes a sharp edge of self-blame. It turns solitude into space. It turns silence into rest. Ask quietly without forcing an answer. If this outcome does not go my way, can I remain whole? You may not answer today. That's okay. Because the moment the grip loosens, even slightly, see, something new appears. Not emptiness, but clarity. Not loss, but room to breathe. And from that space, the next transformation begins. The ability to see life clearly without the distortion of fear or need. 2. Seeing without absorbing. Not everything that touches you needs to enter you. This truth alone can return years of peace to a tired heart. For many people over 60, emotions no longer arrive gently. They arrive heavy. Loneliness settles into the chest in the evening. Old memories surface without warning. A careless word from someone younger can echo for days. And without realizing it, the mind absorbs everything until it feels like carrying a life that has become too heavy to hold. Here is the first shift that brings lightness. Emotions move like the weather, not like truth. A Zen teacher once asked his students to sit quietly during a storm. As thunder shook the walls, some students tensed, others closed their eyes in fear. When the storm passed, the teacher said, "The sky was never disturbed. Only the clouds were loud." Your mind works the same way. Sadness, anger, regret, longing, these are weather patterns. They pass through, they rise, they fall, but they are not who you are. The pain begins when you mistake weather for identity. Another quiet suffering appears here. Feeling becomes becoming. You don't just feel lonely, you become a lonely person. You don't just feel afraid, you become fragile. You don't just feel forgotten, you become invisible. This is where emotional weight multiplies. Buddhist teachings speak gently but firmly about this confusion. They remind us that awareness is not the emotion. It is the space that notices the emotion. You are not the thought that says, "I am alone." You are the one who hears that thought. There is a simple story often shared in monasteries. A monk was asked how he stayed calm while surrounded by suffering. He replied, "And I do not let sorrow rent a room in my mind. I allow it to knock. I listen, and then I let it leave." This is the practice of seeing without absorbing. Presence does not require possession. You can feel sadness without drowning in it. You can notice grief without building a home inside it. You can acknowledge fear without obeying it. For those living in quieter houses and longer nights, this matters deeply. When emotions are absorbed, loneliness feels permanent. When emotions are observed, loneliness becomes a visitor. Awareness becomes the stable ground beneath all changing states. Imagine sitting by a river, watching leaves float past. Some leaves are bright, some are broken, but the river does not chase them. It does not cling. It allows movement. This is the mind trained in observation. When another Zen story tells of a student who complained, "My thoughts never stop," the master smiled and said, "Do you yell at clouds for moving?" The student understood. Thoughts are movement. Awareness is stillness. The more you rest in awareness, the lighter life becomes. Not because pain disappears, but because you no longer carry it unnecessarily. This is natural healing. No pills, no force, just clarity. When emotion arises, and it will, try this simple act of freedom. Silently note, this is passing. No analysis, no judgment, no resistance, just recognition. And something subtle begins to change. The body softens. The breath deepens. The mind stops tightening. This is not avoidance. This is wisdom. Because once awareness grows steady, a small space begins to appear. A pause between sensation and reaction. Now a moment where choice becomes possible. That space is quiet. It is small, but it is powerful. And within that space, for the first time in a long while, you are no longer carried by life. You are standing within it, light, present, and free enough to breathe. 3. The space that changes everything. Between what happens and what you do, there is a moment so small most people never see it. Yet that moment decides whether peace remains or disappears. For many people over 60, reactions feel automatic. A tone of voice stings and the chest tightens. A memory surfaces and sadness takes over the day. A message goes unanswered, and the mind fills the silence with fear. It all feels immediate, unavoidable, like life pulling a lever you no longer control. But here's the truth that quietly returns your power. Your first reaction is not your true self. It is a reflex, a pattern learned over decades, a nervous system responding to old signals, not present danger. In Buddhist teachings, this reflex is never condemned. It is simply observed. Because what can be observed can also be interrupted. There is a Zen story of a monk who was struck by another monk during an argument. Instead of reacting, he stood still. When asked why he did nothing, he replied, "The sound of the strike ended. Why should I continue it inside myself?" This is the pause. The pause is not a weakness. It is not suppression. It is the moment you refuse to let the past drive the present. Another painful misunderstanding lives here. Many believe strength means quick responses, sharp words, and immediate defense. But speed is not strength. Speed is a habit. Stillness is strength. When you pause, even for one breath, you interrupt decades of conditioning. You stop the old loop that says, react, protect, prove, defend. You give the body a new message. You are safe right now. For those facing loneliness, this is profound. Loneliness often does not come from being alone, but from reacting to being alone. The mind rushes in with stories. No one needs me. Time is running out. I am forgotten. The body tightens. The heart closes. But when you pause, something else becomes possible. You feel the sensation without becoming the story. You allow the emotion without obeying it. In monasteries, monks are taught to sit with discomfort until the urge to react fades, not because discomfort disappears, but because the nervous system learns it does not need to panic. This is natural healing at its deepest level. Every pause retrains the body. Every breath taken before reacting teaches the system calm. Over time, reactions slow. Tension releases faster. Presence becomes familiar. Another Zen master was once insulted publicly. He bowed and said nothing. Later, one student asked how he remained so calm. The master replied, "If someone brings you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does it belong?" The pause is a refusal to accept unnecessary suffering. And here is where empowerment returns, quietly without force. You realize you do not need to win every moment. You do not need to explain yourself. You do not need to respond immediately to feel alive. You begin to trust the pause. Try this once today, before speaking, before replying, before deciding. Pause for one breath. That breath is not empty. It is filled with choice. And something unexpected happens when the pause is honored. Arguments lose momentum. Emotional fires starve. Inner conflict softens. Because when the reaction ends, fuel disappears. And from that calm space, small, silent, and often overlooked, life begins to respond to you differently. Not because the world changed, but because you finally did. 4. When fire is no longer fed. Fire survives only when something keeps feeding it. And for most of your life, you were taught to keep feeding every flame. Every comment had to be answered. Every misunderstanding had to be corrected. Every silence had to be filled. Every emotional spark had to be explained, defended, or fought. This habit slowly drains the inner life. By the time people reach their 60s, many are not exhausted by work anymore. They are exhausted by unnecessary battles, arguments long over, words never spoken, conversations replayed in the mind late at night. Here is the first truth that restores dignity. You do not owe your energy to every provocation. In Buddhist teaching, non-reaction is not suppression, it is discernment. It is knowing which fires deserve attention and which ones must be allowed to die on their own. There's a simple Zen story often told to aging monks. A man shouted insults at a master in the marketplace. The master listened quietly, then walked away. Later, a student asked, "Why didn't you defend yourself?" The master replied, "If someone offers you garbage and you refuse it, who carries it?" This is non-reaction. Silence here is not avoidance. Silence is clarity. Another painful belief begins to loosen in this stage of life. The idea that silence means weakness. Many grew up believing that to stay quiet was to lose, that dignity required the last word, that respect had to be demanded. But real dignity arrives when you no longer need to prove your worth. For those experiencing loneliness, this is deeply healing. Loneliness often pulls the mind into old conflicts, replaying voices that are no longer present. Non-reaction cuts that cycle. It says, "I will not continue conversations that steal my peace." A Buddhist teacher once said, "Words are seeds. Silence decides which ones grow." When you stop responding to every emotional seed, the inner garden changes. Calm presence dissolves confrontation in ways force never could. When anger meets anger, fire spreads. When anger meets stillness, it has nowhere to land. This is not passivity, it is mastery. A monk was once asked how he remained so peaceful while surrounded by human suffering. He answered, "I do not add my own fire to the world's burning." This is the quiet power of non-reaction. With age, something sacred becomes clear. Time is no longer infinite. Energy is precious. Peace is worth protecting. Silence becomes a choice, not a withdrawal. As you stop explaining yourself to those who are not listening, you stop arguing with people who have already decided. You stop chasing closure from conversations that will never close, and something surprising happens. The body relaxes, the mind rests, the heart feels less bruised. This is natural healing, not by fixing others, not by controlling outcomes, but by refusing to carry unnecessary weight. Choose one situation, just one, where silence protects your peace. It might be a family tension, a recurring argument, an internal voice that keeps demanding justification. Let that fire go unfed. As resistance fades, space opens. As noise quiets, something deeper begins to rise. Not detachment from life, but a gentle readiness to accept life as it is. And from that acceptance, the final freedom begins to unfold. Peace does not arrive when life becomes perfect. It arrives the moment you stop arguing with reality. For many people later in life, the deepest exhaustion is not physical. It is the quiet, constant resistance against aging, against loss, against change, against the way life turned out. Every "this shouldn't be happening" tightens the heart. Every "it wasn't supposed to be this way" multiplies suffering. Here is the truth Buddhist wisdom offers with great compassion. Pain is part of life. Resistance is optional. Acceptance is often misunderstood. It is not giving up. It is not pretending things don't hurt. It is the clarity to see what is here without fighting it inside yourself. A Zen teacher once said, "When you stop pushing the river, it carries you." Life does not become easier when you accept it. You become steadier. This steadiness is a soft strength. It does not depend on youth, health, money, or recognition. It grows quietly when you allow moments to be as they are, without adding fear, blame, or regret. For those who feel alone, acceptance gently changes the shape of loneliness. It no longer feels like punishment. It becomes space, room to breathe, room to listen, room to rest. Inner stability is not rebuilt in dramatic breakthroughs. It returns through small, repeated acts of allowing. One breath, one pause, one moment of not resisting. Try this once today, without effort or expectation. This moment is allowed to be as it is. Say it gently, not to fix anything, only to stop fighting. If these words speak to something you've been carrying quietly, you're not alone. Subscribe to this channel to continue walking this path of calm strength together. Like this video if it brought you even a small sense of relief. Share it with someone who may need quiet support. And if you feel called, leave a comment below. Sometimes simply being seen is part of the healing. When attention returns again and again to stillness, life reshapes itself, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily from within.